ago. And first of all, I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting here on the lands of the traditional owners, including the Guringai, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and future. And I really want to say that I believe absolutely that this has always been and always will be Aboriginal land.
Yeah.
Whatever we might do. And I'd just like to say to Phil, don't fall into the trap of thinking that everybody thinks the same about the Anzac myth. Maybe there's a different myth about Anzac where that intersection can come in that you were talking about. Jack asked me to talk just to provide some information, perhaps a bit more technical information about the details of what's happening in case people aren't completely familiar with what's happening between the Commonwealth, the federal government and Western Australia that's led up to this situation. So I believe we're all here to stand witness to our opposition to this planned closure of communities in Western Australia, which I see as just simply the latest outrage imposed by governments, white governments, on the Indigenous population of this country. And it fits in a pattern, as Phil said, that started with the first fleet of white authorities deciding they can determine Aboriginal life, of forced changes which have led to deaths and heartbreak, of a lack of respect for the oldest continuous culture on this planet, and for profound and institutionalised racism in this country. And we are still struggling. That war has not ended, Phil, and there are people who know that it hasn't ended, and I think people in this room want it to end, and that's why they're here. So I'll just start by giving you a quote from the Western Australian Deputy Premier, Kim Haines, who said in March this year, and these are his words: "We are not closing Aboriginal communities as part of this program. We're not doing that. What we will do is work with those that are too small to be viable in their own right to see if they want to move.
Yeah.
Some very small communities would lose funding for essential services, and if people chose to stay on the land, they would do so without government support." Well, he must think that we're very stupid, is all I can say, because removing essential services is in effect forcing communities to close. So what's the lead up to this? Part of it's due to changes in federal government funding. Last year it became public that the federal government was proposing to stop paying for municipal and essential services, and reached a deal with Queensland, Victoria, Tasmania and Western Australia so that those states would take over the responsibility of paying for essential services. In New South Wales, the state government has always paid, or in fact not paid, for essential services in remote communities, so that wasn't part of the deal. But South Australia actually held out. They refused to sign that deal because the money that the federal government was offering was not going to make up for the cost of those essential services. It's a budget cutting exercise. And it has just been announced that in fact the state government in South Australia has now done a deal where the federal government will still pay for the essential services in the AQI lands, and the state government will pick up the cost of essential services in the other 60 remote communities in South Australia. So that state government stood up for its remote communities and brokered a deal. However, we know that there's been a federal government report which was written in 2011 and circulated to the West Australian Department of Aboriginal Affairs, and it's just recently been leaked as part of this process, that nominated 192 remote Indigenous communities in Western Australia that the federal government had decided were unsustainable based on population, housing and infrastructure. But the Federal Minister for Indigenous Affairs, Nigel Scullion, is now saying that no community will be forced to close, and the Western Australian government should get out there and tell people that's the truth. What they are doing is the federal government's blaming the Western Australian government, and the Western Australian government's blaming the federal government. But what they're really doing is trying to save money off of Aboriginal people's wellbeing and health. So why didn't Western Australia hold out for a deal like South Australia? Because it fits into a pattern of institutionalised racism in Western Australia. And we can tell that because Colin Barnett can't give the same reason twice for why he wants to close down, remove essential services and let people choose whether to stay there or not. Originally last year, he linked it to the tragic suicide of a young Indigenous boy in Geraldton, but Geraldton isn't a remote Indigenous community. Then he said it was because of the government funding deal, and more recently he said it's because, and I quote, kids aren't getting the education they deserve, healthcare is incredibly difficult, domestic violence in some cases, neglect, abuse of children. I'm not saying in all Aboriginal communities, but we all know it's prevalent. Many of these communities are cut off and can't be accessed during the wet weather. In many of these communities there's no employment opportunities at all. You could say a lot of that about the Central Coast, but we're not proposing to remove essential services. And it's all about how dysfunctional Aboriginal communities are. There is nothing in there about the small remote communities that are doing really well and who have chosen to be like that because they want to be on country and they want to live their traditional life that they're entitled to. It's all blaming the victim. Yeah. So how's the Western Australian government deciding which communities will lose essential services? Well, your guess is as good as mine. When that federal government was leaked, the Minister for Indigenous Affairs, Peter Collier, said that it was appalling to base criteria of unsustainability on population, housing and infrastructure, but he won't give any details about what criteria they will use to decide which communities will lose their essential services. Colin Barnett's been a little bit more informative. He says there'll be a review. It'll be him and his Ministers for Health and Aboriginal Affairs and Regional Development, and they'll have a review, but they won't produce a report because he's not into reports. And he said, and I quote again, "We're just going to roll our sleeves up and start dealing with Aboriginal people in their own communities. We'll consult, there's not going to be a bulldozer type mentality, and we're going to determine which communities continue to get those municipal services and probably better services, but it's not going to be 282. But he's not going to tell us why, because he's not into reports. But, and this is really insidious, he already knows what he's going to find out, because he says he knows, for instance, that evidence will be revealed during the review of appalling mistreatment of little kids. Yeah. So again, we come back to this racist, fundamentally racist attitude. If that man has evidence of mistreatment of children, he should be giving it to the police commissioner and the police should be acting as if anything. Why have a review if you already know what you're going to find? Or could it just be that he's throwing out this stereotype that has been used, falsehoods that were used to justify the Northern Territory intervention on child abuse, which were never found to be substantiated. I'm not saying it's all rosy in Aboriginal communities in Western Australia. We all know that. Every community has problems. And we would be silly and naive to admit that everything is fabulous everywhere. But it's not good enough for the government to choose one or two isolated incidents and use that to stereotype everybody. So, where we come to then is what's happening now to try and stop that process. As Jack said, there are 90 meetings, at least 90 meetings like this around the country. In March, 17th of March, the Federal Senate supported a motion. They noted that the Prime Minister had made appalling remarks about remote Aboriginal communities as a lifestyle choice. Yeah. And they noted the importance of remote communities for cultural, social and emotional wellbeing and the roles these communities play in land management. And so the Senate, which was in fact the Greens, Labor and the crossbenchers, called on the Prime Minister to apologise for his remarks, called on the Federal Government to reinstate the essential services funding to Western Australia, and called on the Barnett Government in Western Australia to abandon its plans to close Aboriginal communities and to instead work with these communities to deliver essential services and support. Now, you might think that's just words and the Senate can't force those things to happen. There's no sign of the Prime Minister apologising. But they do let people know that half the politicians in this country know that this is wrong. And they are doing what they can and they are placing that statement on record. So there is support. The Kimberley Land Council has sent representatives to New York, and on the 20th of April they'll be speaking to the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, which operates to to support the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Now, to our shame, when that declaration was presented to the United Nations in 2007, Australia was one of only 4 countries that voted against it. It was Australia, Canada, New Zealand and the United States. So you can see why those 4, with large Indigenous populations and its ex-British colonies voted against it. I am pleased to say that when government changed, the Rudd government in 2009 endorsed the declaration. So at least we're back on the right side of the ledger there. But those UN declarations don't have the force of law in Australia, but they are international instruments, and that's why the Kulintjaku Land Council is going there. Because they will argue that the forced closures breach Article 10, which states that Indigenous people shall not be forcibly removed from their land or reallocated without their free, prior and informed consent. Article 26, which states the Indigenous peoples have the right to the ownership, use, development and control of their traditional lands. And that's why Colin Barnett is saying we're not closing communities, we're just removing the services. If people choose not to stay there, that's their business. So they are deliberately choosing words to make it sound like they're not breaching the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which shows you that a declaration that has no force of law and is just words is still powerful in this country. But I hope that people will also notice that their actions breach Article 8, which says states, and that means the government, Western Australian Government, shall provide effective mechanisms for the prevention of or redress for any action which has the aim or effect of dispossessing Indigenous peoples of their lands, territories or resources. So we could argue that removing essential services has the aim and certainly the effect of dispossessing Indigenous peoples. Or any form of forced population transfer which has the aim or effect of violating or undermining any of their rights. And Article 9 says that Indigenous peoples have the right to belong to an Indigenous community or nation in accordance with the traditions and customs of the community or nation concerned. And no discrimination of any kind may arise from the exercise of that right, which means that all the small white remote communities that don't lose their essential services should be treated in the same way as remote Indigenous communities. There should not be any discrimination. So what we're doing here, today, I believe, is standing as witnesses. Around Australia, Indigenous people are standing up to draw attention to this latest outrage, and around Australia, non-Indigenous people are standing up with them. Because there are many people who recognise racism when they see it. They recognise disadvantage and seek to redress it. And they recognise dignity and they want to respect it. We know, all of us, that many of those smaller communities in Western Australia are there because people have decided to leave the towns where there are problems and trouble and go and live in country where they can get away from those problems. And we also know that Aboriginal people have the right and the responsibility to live on country. And we know that any respectful government would seek to consult, not before making changes, but they would seek to consult to find out if there are any changes that need to be made. So I hope I speak for all non-Indigenous Australians who despair of the short-sighted, bigoted policies of our governments, feel frustrated that this is still happening in 2015, but who know that we have to stand up and continue to stand up, because if we stay silent, we're just as guilty.
Thank you, Kate. That was terrific.